fascinating.
Hero's hero or a brutal warrior, Brian Walden offers a personal view of Alexander the Great.
The word hero conjures up visions of a resplendent figure, sword in hand, in the front rank of his soldiers, leading them to a glorious victory. That's the kind of hero Homer depicted, like Achilles, Ajax, Odysseus. It's the stuff of poetry and myth. But Alexander the Great was a man, not a myth, and he could have come straight out of the pages of Homer. No man has ever had such an appeal to the imagination of mankind, so that though much else about the ancient world is generally forgotten, his name lives on. He set the standard for heroes, and aspiring heroes have always thought that they had to match that standard. Julius Caesar was furiously jealous of him, and Napoleon Bonaparte kept a history of Alexander as bedside reading. And nor was his appeal only to warriors. Michelangelo set out the square on Rome's capital to the design of Alexander's shield. His appeal was very wide and very deep. Oh, well, thank goodness for a plain tale, because surely there can't be any doubts about the heroic stature of Alexander. Oh, yes, there can, and very grave doubts indeed. Very grave. His physical courage, of course, isn't in question, but almost every other aspect of his career invites suspicion. Alexander the Great was born in 356 BC, the son of Philip II of Macedonia and his wife Olympias. Great men don't necessarily have remarkable parents, but Alexander did. Indeed, his whole life was conditioned by the very different inheritance he got from his father and his mother. As a youth, he quickly grasped that they absolutely detested each other, so that to win the favour of one was to excite the suspicion of the other. His mother was utterly committed to him because she wanted him to inherit the crown. His father's regard was more ambiguous, but Alexander couldn't afford to court his disfavour because the kingship didn't necessarily go to the eldest son in Macedonia. Philip of Macedon has had his reputation utterly eclipsed by that of Alexander, but he was the man who put Macedonia on the scene. Indeed, one contemporary historian described him as the greatest European ever. He, in fact, exploited the divisions in the Greek city-states in order to expand the territory of Macedonia. And in 338 BC, he smashed a Greek coalition at Chaeronea and got himself made Captain General of Greece. Olympias, Alexander's mother, was a strong-willed, reckless woman, carefully planning certain murders, capable, if necessary, of organizing a massacre. There was a witch-like mystical quality to Olympias, a great sacrificer of cattle in her religious frenzies. And it was Alexander's mother who put an idea in his head that became an obsession. She told him that his real father was Zeus, the king of the gods. That idea appealed to Alexander, who later in life spent a great deal of time going to priests and oracles to confirm this divine birth. Naturally enough, they told him that he was indeed the son of Zeus. It was the safe answer and also a profitable one. Though both the Greeks and the Romans after them thought that gods could father humans, it's by no means the case that Alexander lived in an age of blind superstition. The Greek historians Herodotus and Thucydides had already given natural explanations for things that at the time of Homer would have been regarded as supernatural. And Homeric heroes were just as much out of fashion in late 5th century and 4th century Athens as they are today. But not with Alexander they weren't. He was entranced by the whole heroic ideal. He was the contemporary of Darius, the Persian king. He was a contemporary of Demosthenes, the Athenian orator, and Aristotle, the philosopher, who was indeed his own tutor. But he wasn't like these men. He was like Achilles. From his earliest youth, he had aped the heroism of Achilles. And it was a heroism of bravery, savagery, and horror. Alexander was driven, passionately driven, by a love of adventure, a love of battle, a craving for excitement, a desire to live life to its full. Alexander was a romantic, not in the sense of feeling sentimental love. That emotion never governed his conduct, even if he felt it at all. Now, Alexander was a romantic in the late 18th, early 19th century sense of a man who gave absolute ride to his passions. It was his passions that dominated his life. They could be generous, but on the whole, he was indifferent to other people and held their lives cheap. Philip of Macedon was murdered at a wedding in 336 by Pausanias, one of the royal bodyguards. He was stabbed to death. And Pausanias was captured and killed. It's said that Olympias hung a gold crown on his head even as he was pinned to his murderous stake. The assassination of Philip of Macedon is one of the great mysteries of the ancient world. We don't really know why Pausanias chose to murder his own king, though it's very likely that Olympias instigated the crime. But did Alexander have anything to do with it? Well, not a shred of evidence has ever been proved against him. But it is a fact, of course, that it got rid of all his worries about inheriting the crown. He presented himself to the army and was enthusiastically received as king. And along with the crown, Alexander inherited Philip's war against the Persian Empire. Philip II, to placate the Greeks for having lost their independence, announced a war of revenge against Persia for the Persian invasions of Greece 150 years earlier. Historians differ about what Philip's real intentions were. My opinion is that that cautious old soldier would have contented himself with some useful plunder in Asia Minor. But Alexander was very different from his father. He didn't weigh up the profit and loss account of the invasion. Of course, gold and silver would be very welcome, but he was going to Asia for immortal glory. Before he could set out, he had to crush a few revolts that had arisen as a result of Philip's death. He cowed Thessaly. He smashed a number of Thracian tribes, decimated them actually, defeated an Illyrian coalition, and then faced with a revolt in Greece, made an incredibly rapid march to Thebes, which he stormed and razed to the ground, killing 6,000 people and selling the rest into slavery. Greece was the first place, not Persia, Greece was the first place to see what Alexander was really like. He was, as a warrior, most formidable. He'd had experience, of course, prior to becoming king. He'd commanded the Macedonian left wing at Chaeronea, and he was very different from Philip. Philip, a little uncouth in his habits, touch of the tribal chieftain about him, sneered at as a barbarian, was patient, conciliatory, often merciful. Alexander the Great, pupil of Aristotle, steeped in Greek culture, patron of all the arts, wasn't patient and merciful. He was swift and utterly ruthless. If you offered him total submission, he could not only be merciful, he could even be generous. You might get a fine banquet with a lot of elevating conversation, but cross him in any way, and he gave you blood and death. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia with 30,000 foot soldiers and 5,000 cavalry. He was never to see Greece or Macedonia again. From the very outset, he'd planned an unlimited operation. The army had with it scientists, engineers, surveyors, architects, and historians in order to record the conquest of Asia. But before he got down to the serious business of conquering Asia, Alexander had to do something else, which for him was equally serious. Troy, the city immortalized by Homer, had to be visited. Alexander had to identify himself totally with his hero Achilles. So in Troy, which had declined to the status of a village, he had himself crowned with a crown of gold. He then anointed himself with oil and ran naked amongst his companions to the altar of Achilles, which he garlanded. There was a lot more of the same sort of thing. Numerous sacrifices, praying at the temple of Zeus, going to Athena's temple, and most importantly of all, being presented by the priests with a shield and a set of heroic armor. You see, Achilles had also gone into battle with divine armor. I suppose the whole frolic could be regarded in a way as faintly ridiculous. But that isn't how Alexander's contemporaries saw it. They saw it as he saw it, as a plain statement of what he was and what he wanted the world to know he was. He was a believer in the heroic ideals of Homer. He was the new Achilles. And like Achilles, he wasn't entirely mortal. Alexander conquered the Persian Empire and its great king Darius and became great king himself. The brief account of this extraordinary achievement is that he routed the Persians on the Granicus. He routed them again at Issus, which would today be in southern Turkey. Darius himself commanded at Issus, but he ran away, leaving his wife and his mother as prisoners of Alexander. And then Alexander moved on and conquered Phoenicia and Egypt. Then he doubled back, and in 331 he won the decisive battle of the war on the plain of Gaugamela. He routed the Persians. Darius fled. After that great victory, he just mopped up the remnants, and the Persian Empire was his. Darius was murdered later by some of his own men. Naturally, Alexander didn't stop with the Persian Empire. He then invaded India, where he was also victorious. And goodness knows where he would have ended up, except that his troops had had enough. And they mutinied and persuaded him that he ought to return to Persia, which he did. Now there are episodes that I want to take out of this great saga because I think they show us a good deal about the personality of Alexander the Great. But I can't just pass it without saying that it was, of course, a staggering achievement by any lights. We are never sure about the numbers in ancient battles. Historians have a habit of declaring that millions fought on the Persian side. That can't be right, though almost certainly at Gaugamela, Alexander couldn't have been outnumbered less than 10 to 1. He marched extraordinary distances, and he fought against tremendous odds, and the conquest was by any reckoning an absolutely staggering achievement. No wonder all his men, and indeed the Persians too, thought he was a great hero. But things had been happening to Alexander during this conquest. Remember that the war had started out, at least nominally, as a Greek campaign of revenge against the Persians, to punish them for past Persian transgressions. And the Greeks had particular ideas about Orientals. They regarded them as barbarians. Even Aristotle, who was very interested in Oriental religion, is claimed to have said about barbarians, treat them as plants and animals. I can tell you that Alexander's army needed no encouragement to do that. Their conduct left a great deal to be desired. But after Alexander became great king of Persia, he began to adopt Persian customs, and indeed even Persian clothing, or as much of it as he found comfortable. And then he came up with a very imaginative idea: the fusion of Macedonian and Persian blood. He arranged at Susa, the Persian capital, a great wedding ceremony in which he married 2 Persian princesses to add to his existing wife, Roxane, and 90 of his officers also married Persians. But he didn't stop there. He offered a huge bonus to any Macedonian soldier who would marry a Persian. And so, of course, very large numbers of them did. What he did was bitterly controversial at the time, and remained so for at least 300 years afterwards. A lot of Greek and Roman writers simply weren't at ease with the idea that Asians were the equal of Europeans, and Alexander's actions were much criticized. There are some historians who think that Alexander's adaptation to Oriental custom was responsible for a certain coarsening of his character that led to several murders, the most shocking of them being the murder of Clytus. I don't myself agree with that. I don't think that at any time in his life Alexander showed much in the way of restraint, and his savagery was very easily aroused. The murder of Clytus was shocking. Clytus had saved Alexander's life on the Granicus. Alexander had developed the habit of, after dinner, drinking all night long with his companions, and unlike the Greeks who watered their wine, he drank it undiluted in the Macedonian fashion. Both he and Clytus were very drunk, and they quarrelled at table, probably about Alexander's debt to Philip, his real father, not Zeus, his other father. And by the way, Clytus may have said a few harsh words about that divine connection. Despite attempts to restrain him, Alexander speared Clytus to death. Now, murdering your guests at table is infamous, even by the lax standards of Alexander. And he did, for once, appear to show remorse. But as for the claim that this represented some deterioration in character, let's look at what had happened some years earlier, before Alexander had become great king. The Phoenician island city of Tyre put up a spirited resistance against him, but he took it in the end. And when he took it, he sold all the inhabitants into slavery, except for 8,000 that he ordered the army to butcher, and 2,000 more who on his personal order were crucified along the seashore. Alexander was drunk when he murdered Clytus. He was sober at Tyre. The idea that some terrible deterioration had taken place is difficult for me to swallow. We know quite a lot about Alexander's private life, though there are certain things about him we don't know, certain obvious things. We know he was a very small man, but we don't know his actual height. We do know that in common with his society, indeed much of it, he was bisexual. His favourite male lover was Hephaestion, though he was also very fond of one of Darius's court eunuchs. His wife, Roxana, was allegedly very beautiful. She was pregnant at the time of his death and gave birth to an infant son afterwards. They were both murdered 7 years after Alexander's death. A lot of romances about Alexander make out that when he wasn't fighting, he spent his time love-making and drinking. But that isn't true. His preoccupation was politics. It had to be, because politics for Alexander consisted in making absolutely sure that he wasn't dethroned or murdered. And that wasn't paranoia on his part, because plenty of people did want to get rid of him. Alexander died at the age of 32 in Babylon. And of course, no man so outstanding can die so young without foul play being suspected. There were immediate rumors that he'd been poisoned. But we know that he lingered on for 10 days after the banquet at which he was taken ill. And though his contemporaries knew all about virulent poisons, they knew nothing at all about slow-acting poisons. Overwhelmingly, the likelihood is that he died as a result of fever on a weakened constitution. He'd been boating up and down the canals of Babylon, a well-known hotbed of malaria. He'd been drinking solidly for a month after the death of Hephaestion, and his health was already weakened by the 9 wounds he'd sustained, including one very bad one indeed in the chest. There was a tremendous fight for his possessions after his death. His well-preserved body was whipped off by Ptolemy to Alexandria in Egypt. Now, there are many who think, indeed I think it's almost universal, that Alexander represents, in the title of a recent book about him, the heroic ideal. And I'm all the more inclined not to quarrel with that, because I don't think the purpose of studying history is to discover that the past was morally inferior to the present. Alexander's murders and his savagery in war were no worse than those of other despots, and a lot less horrific than what we've seen in our own century. You must make your own mind up, but I'll offer a minority opinion. I am not impressed by the heroism of Alexander. Why? Because I find it chillingly lacking in meaningful purpose. Alexander's motivation was literally childish. As a boy, he'd wanted to be like the hero Achilles, and he burned his life away in following that infantile compulsion. I think heroism requires something more than the gratification of the hero, some purpose beyond that. Alexander was wholly and totally selfish throughout his entire career. What he did for himself alone, not even his immediate family, benefiting in any way from his glory. Indeed, his mother, his wife, and his infant son were all murdered. And I'm not judging him by the standards of the modern world. There were plenty of people in antiquity who acknowledged a motivation outside themselves. For instance, patriotism. Long before Alexander, Leonidas and the Spartans who died at Thermopylae died for Sparta. I don't think Alexander is a good model for aspiring heroes. No one can take away his glory. His name will live forever. But he's the kind of hero that humanity can well do without.
Next week, John F. Kennedy comes under scrutiny at the same time, 7:30. And Brian Walden will be answering questions live on the internet after the final programme in the series. The web address follows shortly.
If you'd like a transcript of these talks, send a cheque or postal order for £4.95, made payable to BBC Education, to Walden on Heroes, P.O. Box 7, London W128UD. Or you can order by phone with a credit card on 0990 100 789.
This week in Meet the Ancestors, BBC Two takes you to the West Country to solve the mystery of Mangotsfield. A 1,700-year-old Roman sarcophagus has been found, and it's up to our team of experts to piece the puzzle together. Going back to Meet the Ancestors, Thursday at 9 on BBC Two.